Okay, well, first of all, thanks, Sunny, for organising all of this. And I remember when we were in the meeting, is it all right to do this, or have I got 2 minutes? And I was sort of saying that a lot of these events around psychedelic research, the psychedelic community, tend to be a bit sort of preaching to the converted, and it'd be nice if we had some debates and to make it tough for all of us to, really think through our ideas. So hence, I guess, what we're doing right now. So how can you explain the experience of mystical consciousness? Well, there are two aspects to tackle this problem as I see it, and I think many others see it this way too. One is to try and account for the psychology of what people call the mystical experience, and then the other aspect is to look at its underpinnings, its biological underpinnings. So in terms of the psychology, a number of scholars have tried to characterize this so-called mystical experience, and I think the one who's really had the greatest impact is Walter Stace in his book Mysticism and Philosophy, I think it is. And it was Stace who, through looking at a range of different religions, Christianity, Islam, paganism, said this about the mystical experience. He said there's a definite type of mystical experience, the same in all these cultures, religions, periods, and social conditions. They share, and then he lists these 7 characteristics. The first one he calls unitary consciousness, characterized by a sense of oneness, a collapse of the multiplicity of things. And he wasn't the first to identify this, but he was perhaps the first to systematically list these different experiences. But the telling thing about this first characteristic of the so-called mystical experience is that Stace says this, and I tend to agree with him quite strongly, that this unitary consciousness, this sense of oneness, is the one basic, essential, nuclear characteristic from which most of the others inevitably follow. And then he lists others: non-spatial, non-temporal, sense of objectivity, a feeling of blessedness, peace and joy, sense of sacred or divine, paradoxicality and ineffability. But I think there's, this point of trying to be parsimonious in science, to try and reduce redundancy, is a very important one. And then if we're going to try and think of the mechanisms underlying this essential nuclear characteristic of the so-called mystical experience, then this is where I would want to put my focus in trying to understand things. He also said, something that we consider, and looking at other scholars' work, the likes of William James, but also very much Stace, he'll talk about this other side of the sense of oneness, what's required for someone to experience a sense of union with everything. And he said in order for that to happen, as others have, there needs to be a breakdown of one's sense of subjectivity, one's sense of self, one's sense of narrative self, one's sense of ego. And only if we can break that barrier between us, our subjective self, and the world outside, can we experience a sense of oneness. And he says this of what it is to have a kind of intact ego, if you want. He says to describe something in the outside world implies, or even in the inside world, implies that it stands over and against one as an object to be looked at and examined and have its characteristics noted. So the point is that we can only describe things if they are other, and it's with the collapse of that we experience this sense of oneness. So I've talked all really about the psychology, but the point that I want to make is that psychology is bottom line. If there wasn't an experience, personally I wouldn't be interested in wanting to understand its biology. So in terms of tackling this question, the fundamentals are the psychology.
Brilliant. Again, as with Robin, and great to be here with Robin, and thanks for organising this, Sunny, and the psychedelic, what do you call yourselves? The what? Psychedelic Studies Imperial. Suspiciously, the PSI, I like that for obvious reasons, perhaps as a parapsychologist. Do I get points if Robin goes over time, by the way?
No. I need to be told I'm going over time.
No, it's fine. So I think Robin did a good job in kind of starting us off, but in terms of how do you actually explain the mystical experience, well, you know, you can try and explain it in many different ways, you know, neuroscientifically, neurobiologically, biologically, psychologically, psychosocially, you know, maybe it serves some kind of interrelationship purpose to have a mystical experience. You could think of it in terms of transpersonal psychology, you know, these experiences of going beyond your own ego identity, but ultimately, are you actually ever able to explain it? You can describe the mystical experience, you can maybe map the territory, you can think about it in discrete biological or psychological ways, but does that actually explain it? I think ultimately the mystical experience is something subjective and experiential. It's something that happens to you. Well, happens to me, or maybe it happens to you as well. So by definition, you can't really explain it, I don't think, because if you can explain it, you're not really talking about the mystical experience, because in its very essence, it's paradoxical and it's ineffable. You can't really even describe it. You can't even put it into words. So you can attempt to describe it, but to try and actually explain it, well, that's a whole different matter. I think you can attempt to do that, but ultimately, because it's a personal experience, I think everyone's individual understanding of it is equally valid, be that kind of mystical or biological or psychological. But to try and explain it, it's a bit like trying to bite your own teeth, essentially. So that'd be my position. I just got a phone call. I shouldn't probably take this, should I?
I would have thought so.
Maybe I'll kind of join them into the conversation. No, that's it. I'll leave it. I'll park it there for now. But over to you.
I mean, the position that something can't be explained is one that personally doesn't satisfy me. You know, I think it has been used and it is used as an excuse sometimes, a kind of way out. You know, a kind of out, and you know, I don't agree with, I certainly don't agree with Richard Dawkins on everything, but I do agree with the likes of Dawkins on this kind of point that, you know, we should never feel that something, even though we don't have it absolutely nailed at this moment, we should never say that a problem is too hard, because when we do, it leaves a space that can be filled by anything, our imagination, you know, you know, whatever we want. And that troubles me, because we can say things like, my intuition tells me that there are these entities and they are sentient, and there is this other world out there and I can experience it on DMT and it's real. And my intuition tells me that, and, you know, or my intuition tells me that the world seems flat. It's flat, I tell you, you know. And it's only when we improve our methods and we have certain major paradigm shifts and breakthroughs that we can really get a handle on these things. I would actually say, in the case of the mystical experience, there's something in the term mystical, you know, this sense of mystery, of not knowing, that I think is almost like there's something emotional in it, in the sense that people don't want it explained. You know, don't go there. This is my experience. It changed my life. Don't you dare tell me that this rests on brain activity. I think when we come at something from that emotive position, we can get things wrong. I think it's often the thing that contributes to kind of fallacies of logic, wishful thinking or fearful thinking that leads us to get things wrong. Yeah.
Can I jump in there?
Of course.
So I kind of salute your endeavour to try and kind of map these things from a kind of biological perspective, but that in itself is only one particular perspective. And this idea of promissory science, whereby there's a promise that if we pursue the idea of the tenets of neuroscience, material reductionism, that will ultimately be able to explain everything. That's kind of based on a bit of a belief and an assumption. And I think, all kind of great ideas, and you talk about kind of having paradigm shifts within science. All science is built on the imagination. So, I think we should actually actively be using our imagination. Science itself was born from ideas, first of all. And so that's very useful, to kind of misquote Einstein, I think, because imagination is more important than facts. It's something like that, probably really? Totally misquoted. That'll do for me, though. Don't let the kind of truth get in the way of a good misquotation. Yeah.
No, I don't agree with that.
But I think imagination is important, and I don't think there's any one kind of road to truth necessarily. And I think that biological explanations will get us so far, but it may be that they don't take us far enough. It could be that we keep kind of tunneling down further and further inside the brain, trying to understand its mysteries. And yet what we find is just it gets more and more complex. And ultimately you're just kind of looking for, better algorithms to try and make sense of it all. But it could be infinitely complex, and that the actual explanations that you're seeking are like chimera. They just kind of disappear off into the distance the closer you get to them. So I'm saying asking for plurality and that we don't just necessarily try and take one particular approach to try and understand it. I'm not kind of bothered about upsetting people by having explanations. I think explanations are really useful, but I think we have to recognize the explanations are limited to a particular realm of understanding. If you kind of speak to a shaman, they'll give you a good explanation of a mystical experience, which is probably as kind of complex and convoluted as a neuroscientific explanation, and maybe based on decades of studying kind of the spirits of nature, whatever they may be, which you may not understand in the slightest. It sounds like gobbledygook, as much as a neuroscientific explanation to them will sound like gobbledygook. So there's different ways of kind of perceiving reality and coming to understand the world.
Can we do one more on this topic?
Yeah.
I kind of agree with bits of it, and then quite strongly disagree with other bits. So,
good.
The bit that I agree on is that there are two aspects of perspective. There's one where you can look at the subjective, the quality of the experience, and appraise it that way, and there's one where you can look at the biology. My own endeavour and that of our team is to try and make a mapping between the two that is plausible, that's satisfactory, that works. That's the thing about science. It leads to hypotheses that you can test and see whether they survive or not. And it's that even though imagination feeds the hypotheses, but also data informing the imagination, that's a difference. So it's this charge that science is somehow a belief system has never stuck with me, because it's a method, and it's a method of testing your ideas. And I think otherwise beliefs, it's kind of blind faith.
Can I jump in there, Robin?
Okay.
Well, I agree with you. I think science is a method, not a belief system, but people use it like a belief system. So they kind of take as a kind of certain a priori givens, like materialist reductionism. So could there be, if you were kind of to test, you don't actually try and destruction test the idea of materialist reductionism. You take it as a given, and then you try and build on it from there. It's kind of like you're trying to find affirmations for it, rather than in a kind of pop area sense, kind of try and falsify it. But would there be some kind of evidence which would, for you, allow you to falsify the notion of materialist reductionism?
Well, materialist reductionism I wouldn't say that's my approach.
Okay.
It's one where I can allow the psychology, people's experiences, to sit. And I'm not trying to explain them away in any way. I'm just trying to say that if you want to know what's going on at a physiological level when you meet this archetypal being, this is a I suppose, a hypothesis for what we might see, and we're going to test it, and if it holds up, then it becomes reliable, and I can say with some confidence that this is the material underpinnings of your experience. That then doesn't say that all your experience is this biology. It just says this is the material flip side of your subjective experience. So the kind of philosophical approach, if you want, is one that's referred to as this dual aspect monism. So it's saying that there is this world. We don't need to require some kind of other notion that might be sort of poorly sort of laid out, whatever it is, it's some kind of metaphysical notions. But these are the two aspects that we'll look at. So the reductionism is something that kind of irks me a little bit, because I don't feel like I'm reducing anything. I want to allow the psychology to sit. I don't want to depreciate any of it, but I'd like to say, look, the locus of the processes and the action is here. Yeah.
Round two. So, what is the collective unconscious? Are we actually tapping into some other worldly thing? Is that the kind of question? I think, so the collective unconscious, again, is whatever you want it to be, really. It's just a label. Jung came up with it about 100 years ago, and for Jung, he used it in terms of describing the realm of those kind of conscious experiences which are shared among beings of the same species, well, humans at least. We don't know about the other species. Maybe kind of cats and goats have their own collective unconscious, and maybe even elves too. Who knows? But it's the kind of the realm of the archetypes, which kind of Jung attempted to kind of try and identify as these kind of mythological elements of the collective psyche, which we somehow inherit. And I'm not sure where Jung sat on where the collective unconscious actually exists. He said it was kind of outside of the individual unconscious, but whether it exists beyond the brain, for instance, I'm not sure he particularly speculated on that point. Maybe Robin can fill us in a bit more on that. But certainly, when you gaze into the medicine bag for a little bit too long, you do start delving into these kind of mythological realms. You start operating in these kind of more associative, mythological, non-linear, kind of synchronistic, kind of atavistic kind of regions where the mythologies and the fairy tales of your youth somehow start to kind of all collide and make sense, and in some kind of unfathomable way. And so I think Jung was trying to get at those experiences which we readily have in altered states of consciousness. But what actually is it? What is the kind of collective unconscious? It's whatever Jung wanted it to be, or whatever we want it to be, really. And you could maybe think of it as being some kind of underlying biological programming, or it could be some kind of morphic field in a Sheldrakean sense, or it could be the Akashic records, or it could be just some kind of collective, cultural, subjective delusion whereby we think we're tapping into something out there, but it's really just in here. It's based on the fact that we've all watched the same TV programs and read the same books. So it could be any one of those things, I think. And but I think I like to keep an open mind and speculate and kind of weigh all those things and hold all those things, and just hold them there without necessarily hanging on to any of them.
Yeah. Well, the collective unconscious, I wouldn't agree that it's whatever we want it to be. It'd be a bit unfair to call his body of work. Forgive me if I read a little bit from one of the books, Spirit in Man, Art and Literature, in which he described it. But I think it's important because it's informative, and in places it's kind of beautiful. He says that it's this aspect of our minds handed down to us from primordial times in the specific form of mnemonic images. And I think that aspect that it's memory images is important, or inherited in the anatomical structure of the brain. There are no inborn ideas, but there are inborn possibilities of ideas that set bounds to even the boldest fantasy and keep our fantasy activity within certain categories, a priori, ideas as it were. Let me get to some other good bits. The primordial image, let that sit with you, or archetype. So the archetype is a primordial image. It's what's passed down to us through inheritance. It's logged in our minds and, crucially, as Jung says, in our brains. Is a figure, be it a demon, a human being, or a process that constantly recurs in the course of history. It appears wherever creative fantasy is freely expressed. Essentially, it is a mythological figure. When we examine these images more closely, we find that they give form to countless typical experiences of our ancestors. They are, so to speak, the psychic residual of innumerable experiences of the same type. They present a picture of psychic life in the average. So it's this idea that what's been lived before is passed down to us, and then it becomes part of our collective minds, our collective psyches. You can see its expression in art, you can see its expression in religion. But Jung's point was that it was never something other. It was earthy, it was always earthy. And it's in our minds, it's in our brains. This misconception that Jung is somehow, because he was interested in the spiritual experience, somehow, not earthy. It really annoys me because he was a good scientist. One of my favourite quotes of Jung's is that doubt alone is the mother of scientific truth. Doubt alone. I think that's important.
I'd happen to agree with that. I'd like to kind of salute your kind of support of Jung being a kind of psychoneuropharmacologist. I think that's really important and kind of very exceptional. So, but doubt is a good thing. We should also be doubting our very kind of own inner kind of belief structures and our own kind of methods and science and all the rest of it as well. The thing about scientific doubt, it's all too easy to doubt other doctrines, and yet it doesn't necessarily reflexively look at itself often enough and doubt its own biases and beliefs. So I'll just kind of leave that hanging there. I mean, I'll kind of just throw it out there as controversially then. You could look at, you kind of quoted Jung, and he's talking very much about kind of the anatomical structures of the brain house these archetypes and these collective unconscious. But could it just equally be perhaps morphic fields in a kind of Sheldrakean sense? I'll bring that back up again. Sheldrake, we'll mention Sheldrake again.
So tell me about morphic fields.
So I'm not Sheldrake, okay, but I'll do my best. So that is that there are kind of fields in consciousness, but mind at large, if you like, not kind of brain-based consciousness, whereby habits build up over time and develop certain trends. So you could explain instincts, for instance. The fact that kind of people, animals, any kind of species is born with a particular habit, which it would seem difficult to explain by its pure biological programming. Like, for instance, there was, in the war years, before the war, there was certain birds would come and peck the tops of the milk bottles, the foil, and it kind of took a while, initially to spread, and these birds would come along and peck the tops of the milk bottle tops and get the cream out. But then during the war, they didn't use the foil. And then it was a whole generation of birds of that species died out before the end of the war, and they started using foil again. But the very moment they introduced the foil, the birds had this habit, which couldn't have been kind of come about, one would assume, through some kind of natural selection or even imprinted in their kind of biological makeup in the space of a generation or two.
Well, it could. That wasn't a count, as far as I could tell, of morphic fields.
It's possible. Well, morphic fields could be an explanation.
Fields? What are morphic fields?
So kind of built up habits.
But what are that's a psychology, that's behavior.
No, okay, so I don't think I don't think Sheldrake presumes to know exactly what they are, other than that they have field-like effects, and that they can resonate through time, basically, that there's a resonance between things that have happened in the past and things that happen in the future, and that there are kind of habits within nature rather than laws, and so that these habits are built up through the accretion of things that have occurred before in a kind of field, like a field of consciousness.
That kind of field sounds too vague for me.
Sure,
I need to know what it is, because otherwise it's nothing apart from imagination. Because I mean, what you're describing is behaviour, and perhaps we could propose that epigenetic mechanisms could account for the transfer of learnt knowledge, experience to one's progeny, and there's evidence for that. So, for example, rodent work has found that if you, in a kind of Pavlovian way, twin a scent, even a pleasant scent like of roses, with an aversive stimuli like a shock, then in the progeny of that animal, if exposed to the scent, then they'll experience the same fear effect. And we can account for that by epigenetic mechanisms. So that's something firmer that we can demonstrate and test and characterize quite precisely and put to the test. So my challenge to something like morphic resonance, that's why I was being a bit annoying, is that when people have these outlandish, well, let's just say alternative views, when they're challenged on them, I often find that they're ethereal. There's nothing there. And so, although I was being a bit of a, well,
No, that's good. It's good to be
challenged. Yeah, it's this kind of thing that needs to be done, so that there's a discipline to science, where you can't get away with just saying it's kind of like,
Well, it's not my theory. But
No.
I mean, okay. Well, explain to me what consciousness is then, and then I'll accept the fact that you say it's kind of like a conscious field. Well, you can't get away with that. So, can you get away with saying consciousness is? What is consciousness, Robin?
So I'll give it a shot. So I think when we try and understand consciousness, often we leave it as a slightly vague and ill-defined thing. And I think the reason why we're interested in consciousness, if we're honest enough to admit it or not, is because we are sort of seduced in a way by our human consciousness. I think if we only had the kind of consciousnness that other animals have, we wouldn't be interested in consciousness. So I think we have to be honest. And I don't think that's kind of, what's the term, sort of inflating the importance of humans. It's just the reality. And so it's self-consciousness. It's this ability to self-reflect that really, I think, attracts people to this problem of consciousness, and the reason why we even have a term for this thing, consciousness, because it's quite a new term as well. You track back in sort of ancient literature and you don't really find it. It's relatively new. So, what's its basis? And my proposal would be, leaning on empirical work, brain imaging work, is that there is not a region. That would be too easy. And that's not the way we think of brain function these days, but a distributed system, a dynamic system. And I would be willing to make a hypothesis about what that system is, again, based on evidence that's out there. And I would propose it's the default mode network, and it's the dynamics of this default mode network. And so I would say that this is the biological counterpart, the best candidate that we have, that we should scrutinize as much as we can while keeping an open mind about other possibilities. But this is the strongest candidate I would have for a system that maps onto self-consciousness, which is the thing that we're really interested in.
Are these entity encounters people have on psychedelics real? Well, I think there's a bit of a flaw in the question, and I'm going to try and wriggle out of it. In that, what is reality, basically? What do we mean by real? I mean, can you have an unreal experience? Surely everything you experience is some kind of reality, right? That is your reality in the moment of the experience itself. there is no real reality in the sense of an objective world, which we can all agree on. We have a kind of a collective subjective illusion of an objective outside external reality, which we share through language and symbols and perception, our sensory experience. But I don't necessarily know if my experience of the world is the same as Robin's, as he describes it. My experience of this experience here is probably going to be different from Robin's for many other reasons. But can we agree that this is a kind of objective thing out there? So I think reality itself is pretty slippy character to actually kind of pin down. And the best we have are kind of collective subjective experiences, which more or less concur when we kind of stack them up together. Objectivity is basically a subjective illusion, and reality is whatever you can get away with, as Robert Anton Wilson basically said. So the real question should be, are we having genuine encounters, experiences with other than us sentient beings? Okay, that's kind of the question we want. This is kind of the ontological kind of money shot, if you like. And I think the jury's out, okay? We don't really know. I think we haven't really mapped the phenomenology of these experiences fully enough yet. We can look at the commonalities and patterns of the kind of experiences that people have. You get elves, everybody does, as Terence McKenna said, of course. But are those elves kind of culturally mediated elves because Terence McKenna went around proselytizing about elves, and so then everyone who takes DMT gets elves? Or are they a kind of core experience to the DMT, phenomena? And actually, when you look back to the very first accounts from Stephen Zara in the 1950s, people got elves. Actually, there were little orange dwarves in the first kind of experiences, but nonetheless, little people. And there's other commonalities as well. You could be, unempathic, hive mind, praying mantis, pro bono proctologists. They seem to pop up quite a lot, inserting probes into your farming of your emotions. So why is it we have some kind of basic underlying biological predisposition to experience really unemotional praying mantises doing strange operations on us with kind of baffling commonality and frequency in people seemingly naive to everyone else's experience, or my own encounters as of other people with kind of smiling, swirling, hypnotic, multi-eyed serpent beasties, which also seem to pop up with terrifying regularity. So the jury's out, so we can find some commonalities and patterns in the kinds of experiences that people have. But it's not really possible to have a culturally unmediated experience, right? We don't know what everyone's kind of life experiences and cultural influences have been. That they never did the Eskimos smoking DMT experiment, right? That was just a kind of college myth in Berkeley in the 60s. It's like, oh yeah, so there's this story going around, that the Eskimos saw jaguars and serpents when they give them like ayahuasca or DMT, ayahuasca I think it was, and that kind of put forward the notion that there are these kind of core archetypal entities that people encounter with certain substances. That experiment never happened. So what we can do is some kind of mystical jigsaw puzzling, I think, and try and map the phenomenology. But whether we'll actually get down to the core, ultimate kind of nub of the question is, and I'm ranting now, can you actually say are these things genuine other than us entities is a really difficult question to get at. You can kind of find some kind of biological correlates and maybe explanations, but I don't think there's any kind of ultimate arbiter on truth and reality when it comes to psychedelic entity encounters. Sorry for ranting. Robin.
Okay, Tuesday. I've circled, written down here, like, yes, and highlighted as well, that they're real in the sense that a dream is real. There's a psychological reality or even someone's delusion or hallucination. It's real, as Dave says, so I agree with him on that point. And then this question of what is reality, I think tends to be sort of made slippy, I think, by people of a certain perspective, perhaps that are, would challenge, say, a materialist perspective. Would that be fair? Is there one reality? And so I can only say, well, all the evidence tends to suggest there is this world, and it's not entirely illusory, because if I try to put my hand through this wall, I can't, And so there are some physical laws that we kind of have to respect, because they seem to be quite reliable. And so in that sense, they are real, but what are they? Why has this kind of meme, in a way, of entity experiences stuck, and why has it been so invested in, almost as if it's the beginnings of a kind of religion? And the reason why that might be is because it resonates. Because first of all, you can experience it with some reliability. In our DMT studies, people have had these experiences. And so then you have an experience, and you build a narrative around it. One thing that people tend to do is to externalize. And so I find it as intriguing, mysterious, as deeply fascinating, and an opportunity to think this comes from the mind and from the brain. What is its basis? What is its nature? I don't feel the need to say that it's out there, that externalization that humans do, that can at times be a kind of defense. It can be, if we do it as part of ourselves, say, what Carl Jung would call our shadow, say, and we project it out there, all of a sudden it's something that's not disconcerting that's in us, but it's something out there, and we can point our fingers at it and say, bad stuff out there, And I sort of feel like a similar thing may be going on with entities, in that if we say they are out there, wherever out there is, and I challenge people to come up with a hypothesis about where that out there is and to test it. And I really do, make that challenge, and good luck. But we do that because then, rather than it be, this is a facet of our minds, our collective unconscious, the average of our experience over time, which of course, as we look around the room, what do we see? Entities everywhere. We're born into this world. What do we see? The first thing we see are entities, And so it just stands to reason that very strongly within our collective unconscious are entities. And if you create the noise in the brain through the action of a psychedelic drug, then within noise, like how in white noise you start hearing voices, you see something that our minds are primed to see, which is entities. It's just the more plausible explanation. I really do lay down that challenge. If it's out there, so I don't think the jury's out. If it's out there, give me something, give me something other than externalization, fantasy, and imagination.
I wouldn't necessarily kind of say internal, external anyway. I mean, they experience it as an other, right? But internal, external is kind of, but why, if people are kind of staring into their shadow and they're unconscious, do they get praying mantis, unempathic, emotional farming kind of surgeons, brain surgeons operating on them? Why that one specific thing, which a lot of people report seemingly naively,
Yeah.
Why is it everyone's tapping into that? It needs a new archetype, or why that one?
Does it need a new archetype? It sounds a little bit like the trickster, something that's malevolent, and it can morph because of the lability of one's mind and imagination. We can imagine those things and draw them. So why can't they? Must be there somewhere. They must be in our minds. Unless you believe in some kind of divine intervention. You can imagine these things, but why is it everybody seemingly independently, well, not everybody, a lot of people independently, naively, having the encounters with really obscure and yet very kind of thematically similar entities? Because of the collective unconscious.
That sounds like a bit of a circular argument, Robin.
But no, it's our minds.
Okay, well, it's your minds, but why that specific thing? You know, what is it about our shadow or our collective unconscious that has these praying mantis beings that farm us for emotions, for instance?
Because we have shared experiences that are passed down through our ancestry.
When there were 50-foot tall praying mantises
farming
us for our emotions.
But flip it around, give me a more plausible explanation other than it comes from our minds, really.
Well, sure, it comes from our minds, but I'm not necessarily, my definition of the mind may not be the same definition of yours, right? I'm not sure where the limits of the mind are, and I don't think it necessarily resides solely within the brain or emanates from the brain. I'm not sure.
Where else does it reside?
Well, it could be anywhere. I mean,
where?
Why the brain? I mean, just on a bit physiological level, it could be in your gut as well, you know. Yeah. It could be in your feet, but it could also perhaps be beyond us as well. It could maybe extend beyond, or maybe it could be suffused everywhere.
I could take that the brain, you can have an extended brain, you know, in the sense that the brain doesn't reside as something that's entirely compartmentalized away from the rest of the body, and also that the mind is shaped by its interaction with the environment. So in that sense, you could talk about an extended mind and an extended brain, but I wouldn't go so far as to say the mind could be anywhere.
Well, why not?
Because we need a bit of evidence.
Well, we have evidence.
Go on then.
Well, I mean, there's lots of people have, you know, anecdotally, people have experiences of telepathy and.
Those are anecdotes.
Just anecdotally, but then we have scientific evidence as well.
Do we?
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Well, there's loads of it. You've probably not come across it, and because it's a taboo, you know, within science, that this is just pseudoscience, and therefore people like yourself who worry about their respectability, unlike me, don't engage with parapsychology. You know,
I just have a healthy skepticism. I haven't seen anything that's felt compelling. You know, even Daryl Bem's work.
Sure.
He's got a strong investment and had early on in parapsychology. So you know. For me, that's where the jury's out. You know?
But then you're kind of like, you're saying you can't be an objective scientist, right? Because he had an interest in parapsychology, but you have an interest in neurobiology. So should we be skeptical about your theories of reality?
Yeah. Well, maybe. Yeah. No. Truly. Yeah, yeah. Question them. Test them.
Yeah.
And never be too sure. Absolutely. However, you can get some confidence when you find that certain things that you're proposing end up being quite reliable, and you start seeing them when they're being tested here, there, and everywhere.
My own experiments, I've run a series of experiments on precognition, which are, I think, pretty watertight. It's really abstract. They're very difficult. You couldn't possibly cheat it, I don't think, and yet you get the evidence. You get your kind of p-values. You get your significance, and these have been replicated. You know. Like the odds of getting the results we've got are, you know, less than 1 in 10,000. That's just my own studies, you know, and some people have independently replicated. Yeah. Then there's meta-analyses of lots of parapsychological experiments which have produced highly significant results, and that's scientific data, right?
Sure. I mean, without scrutinizing the individual studies and looking at what's going on, I can't really comment other than, you know, quite interesting. But I'm skeptical.
That's fair enough. That's good.
Yeah. That's good. I do think there can be this kind of there's a curious thing in the human condition where we would love for there to be something other. And what drives it, I don't know. Maybe it's related to death denial or something. If there's something other, then maybe there's something other when we die. You know.
Can I counter that as well, though? Because when people have extraordinary experiences which kind of defy your kind of nice, safe sense of material reality, they tend to be very skeptical about them the further away they get away from the experience. So actually, people have a tendency to, in the West at least, towards a kind of rational skepticalization of these extraordinary experiences rather than a kind of fantasy of wanting to have them. People who kind of often feel bamboozled, they question their own sense of sanity, and they become very skeptical about their experiences. So it's actually the opposite, I would say, is equally true. And so that there may be a sense, you know, an idea that we have a fantasy of wanting there to be another, but when you have an experience of the other, it can be pretty disturbing. and you'd want to move away from that.
I mean, I guess bottom line is you have the experience, and then what do you do with it, and you can't not then have it because you've had it, so you have to do something with it in terms of a narrative. I suppose maybe in the West we have a bias to think, well, that came from my mind and my mind's intimately related to my brain. Maybe something was going on there. Maybe this is an opportunity to understand the brain, what it does and how it works. Or you could, it's kind of this locus of being or locus of action, which, in other cultures would be ascribed to the spirit world or, to the sentience of the plant that you've ingested or whatever. Although that's interesting, I kind of see the logic in a way, there are these fallacies of logic that can happen when something seems intuitively appealing, but then ends up being wrong. My own feeling is that that it's more reliable evidence for the fact that it's in our minds and in our brains. But that kind of wishful thing is important. When we do get things wrong, it tends to be either because we really want something to be true, or we fear that something's true, and therefore that fear kind of biases our judgment. It's going to come up again. What do you mean by reality? But can psychedelics teach us about the nature of the world stuff? Absolutely, it can. And the mind is a pivotal aspect of the world. An essential aspect. But I guess part of the question may be about this idea that somehow you see more of what's there, or you see into another reality, but you already know that I think there's no evidence base for that. It might feel like that, but I want something to go on other than just these ideas, and so it brings us back to this notion of locus of action and where it's happening, and the evidence just says it's in our minds. So I guess it's difficult to say any more than that. Absolutely, psychedelics can tell us things. Incredibly powerful tools for revealing. That's by their very definition what they do. They're mind revealing. I kind of wish that people would be more drawn to and interested in psychology and its biology. That take it or leave it, whatever they want. But at least our psychology, rather than thinking up some metaphysical notions about stuff out there that is so loose that it just has nothing to it. Why can't people will say to me, you're trying to give me this message that it's all in our minds. I'm like, isn't that incredible? It's in our minds. This comes from an action on the brain. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. Let's study this. Let's understand it better. And through understanding it better, we're going to understand ourselves better. And that can only have a positive impact. If we want to throw it out there, then we'll be doing all this nonsense work rather than taking a good look at ourselves.
I fully support everything Robin says there. Just to kind of tackle the question you said, can psychedelics teach us about the nature of reality? I think they certainly appear as though they can. You have these experiences where you think you're understanding something about the nature of reality. But we don't really know what reality is anyway, so we get into that whole conundrum all over again. But I think they can teach us there's many ways to experience reality, and that we are kind of quite obsessed in the West. What did kind of Charles Laughlin call it? The guy who came up with neurophenomenology. I know he did come up with it. He ranted about it anyway. He basically said we're kind of monophasic as a culture. We only really value the waking, conscious, alert state of being, of consciousness. And yet other cultures value lots of states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness, be it through psychedelics or through dreams. But we're kind of quite obsessed with this kind of monophasic mania, if you like. So the psychedelics allow us to kind of experience different realities, or experience reality in a different way through different states of consciousness. And that can be really useful. It can help us maybe understand how our experiences shape our perceptions, and how our perceptions shape our beliefs, and then how our beliefs shape our perceptions and our experiences, and that they're all kind of bound up together. And then what you find is when you kind of give those a kind of looser lead or looser kind of leash, they just kind of tend to expand in what becomes possible. So they kind of illuminate the possible through kind of allowing us to have broader experiences of reality. And I think that can be usefully applied to different ways of thinking about the world as well. So like we don't really apply, when we study psychedelics, but we study psychedelics very strictly in the West from the sober state of consciousness. The Charles Tart, transpersonal psychologist, suggested we should have state-specific sciences where we study altered states through the altered state itself, or we study science through an altered state of consciousness, and we come up with a very different kind of view on the nature of reality and the nature of science if we did that. So I think we should kind of maybe look to be more reflexive on our approach on science and reality. And I'd also just kind of like to quickly throw in, if I have some time, that they can give rise to transpersonal experiences, which would almost certainly make you question the nature of reality as it is kind of collectively accepted in the West. We talk about having material reality, but it's all very good and very reliable most of the time, but it can work in the opposite way. You can try and get out the door, but if you've just drank a bottle of cough mixture, for instance, as I once did, and then you try and get out the door and you find you can't go through the door, and then you look to the left and your body's 3 feet to the left of you, and you have to then shuffle overwards because you're having an out-of-body experience. And to actually physically get through the door, you have to move your kind of actual physical body to where your perception was. Then that can give you a very different sense of the nature of reality and physical space and all this stuff.
But you did get it wrong.
Yeah, I was actually going to the toilet. It turned out very badly.
Shall I go? Where are we again? We've got to, sorry, I left my body and started floating up there somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, of course. I love working with Robin. He's a brilliant, proper scientist, and I'm just kind of making it up as I go along. But he's doing some fantastic work. I think there should be more kind of communication and collaboration between neuroscience and parapsychology, not least because we can understand loads of kind of interesting things about the possible neurobiology of and the neurochemistry of extraordinary experiences, of exceptional experiences like entity encounters, and certainly from a kind of neurobiological, cognitive, scientific perspective. And that can be really usefully inform us, give us larger pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So that's great. And I think parapsychology can also help us perhaps understand something about neuroscience and the mind-body issue, which, although Robin probably doesn't think there's necessarily a mind-body problem as such,
there's a problem.
There's a problem. That's good. That's a relief. That's a good
it's
start.
Hard, yeah.
The hard problem of consciousness. Yeah. How do we get from matter to this kind of intangible stuff, right? Well, it's not even stuff, just consciousness, mind, and it could be that parapsychology can shed some light on that, because we don't know what the nature of the interaction between mind and body is. But we could look to kind of tips, like there's kind of certain clues perhaps, we kind of lead us in a direction of study. For instance, that, people in deep dissociative states tend to have more psychic experiences. Is there something about the very nature between the connection between your consciousness and your body, if you can be dualistic and separate them out, which requires some kind of psychic energy just to kind of throw that as a really kind of woo word, but you know, is there something that the energy, the psychic, whatever it is that you use to kind of connect your mind to your body when you get into a dissociative state leads you to kind of be able to transcend time and space a bit more, but when you're very embodied, you don't have those very transcendent experiences of time and space. So there's something, maybe the nub of that transcendent experience is what holds you to your body. I'll just throw that out there as an idea, really. But you know, there could be a two-way communication, and it can help us inform our understanding of the brain-mind.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, it's. I think I need to perhaps, you know, understand. Sorry to do this. What is parapsychology? How would you define it?
Okay, so the study of phenomena which, if taken at face value, do not fit within our current understanding of science, although that's a kind of psychological understanding of science, not a kind of what's going on in physics currently is way weirder than anything in parapsychology, so we probably have to redefine that.
The para bit, does it mean like around psychology?
Yeah, so it's kind of like beside psychology. Okay. And I mean, at some point, it'll all be kind of just basic psychology because we'll understand these experiences in a kind of promissory way, perhaps, maybe not.
I mean, that would be my view. And, you know, I'd like to be diplomatic as much as possible, you know, and I'd personally, you know, kind of personal agenda, if you want, that kind of word seems to have negative connotations, or maybe that's just my projection. But no, is to kind of bridge build rather than. So I don't want to, you know, and I'm conscious of that when I do these kind of things. I don't want to annoy people. I want to make friends. You know?
Let's have a hug.
But I sort of feel like unusual phenomenon, extraordinary phenomenon. Shouldn't be explained away, but should be explained, or should is a strong word, can potentially be explained, in my view, on a level that's satisfactory. Maybe it requires a paradigm shift. If it does, amazing. But my feeling is that maybe a lot of this stuff could be explained in a kind of Occam's razor sort of, there'll be simple, plausible explanations that might not make the hairs on our neck stand up, but they might just be what's going on. That often happens, I find, with sort of supposed sort of paranormal, you know, metaphysical phenomena maybe. You know, you end up finding out that, I mean, Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, has this anecdote of where I think his mum died maybe, and she's in the hospital, and he's how does it work? The nurse, she dies, and they come in and they're like, the clock stopped, and when did Mum die? What, the clock stopped when she died, and then like, and the hairs stand up on your neck, and you're like, oh my God, there's something going on that's beyond our understanding of physics. And then I think Richard Feynman goes and picks up this clock, shakes it a little bit, and it starts going. Then he puts it back on the wall, and the clock stops again. And he's like, when someone dies, you register the time, don't you? And the nurse says, yeah, I took the clock off the wall, you know. And then it's like, I really wished it was something, you know, beyond our understanding of it. And that's just a silly anecdote, but there's something in it, you know, that even things like telepathy and whatever, and we get these positive findings, they're intriguing, but it's a bit like in psychiatry, you know, if something seems to work for, say, something like depression, that's great, that's a really important start, but if you can then show how it works, really all of a sudden, you know, the mainstream can become much more interested in your findings. The same you know, that happened with deep brain stimulation for depression, and maybe, hopefully, it will happen with psilocybin for depression. And so, yeah, if you can show that, you know, say telepathy, even if it's something like implicit mechanisms, implicit processing, or maybe even, forgive me for saying, implicit biases contributing, then it's something that happens, and this is the explanation that we have. So, you know, yeah, open to collaboration, of course. I'm going to do, please, I hope you don't mind me reading from Jung, but before I do that, let me just talk to you. How can psychedelics serve the future of humanity? For me, it's quite simple, although it's not that simple because it's complex. But things are allowed to be paradoxical. So if we are going to affect things in a positive way, you know, at the end of the day, it's perspective and behavior that maybe is perhaps, although some people have argued this kind of thing in terms of levels of violence in the world, is going in a perhaps negative direction, at least in some senses. And so what do you then need to tackle? Well, a very direct way to tackle this problem would be to have some kind of intervention that could change perspective and behavior. And, you know, we've got evidence that psychedelics can do that they tend to promote a sense of values that would go more with perhaps liberal political perspective and against sort of blind, authoritarian, dogmatic political perspective. Also changing perspective in the direction of feeling more connected to nature, valuing nature and the environment. What's more important than that? And of course, it's going to become increasingly important as things literally heat up. So maybe we've got something there, and this is where, if you just allow me, I know it's a bit sad, but I'll read from Jung, because, you know, really what's happening here with psychedelics it's not magic. They are revealing the mind, and through understanding our own minds, our own shadows, our unconscious, we're less at its mercy. Really, that was Freud and perhaps especially Jung's point, that through knowing ourselves better, we would be less inclined to harm ourselves and other people and feel hurt, you know. Freud was so confident, he said, what future is there for the neurotic? He thought he'd kind of cracked mental health, but maybe he's a bit too confident, too much cocaine perhaps. Okay, so that's really unfair to Freud because he was a great thinker. The psyche, this is Carl Jung, the psyche is the world's pivot. It's the world's pivot. Not only is it the one great condition for the existence of a world at all, it is also an intervention in the existing natural order. And no one can say with certainty where this intervention will finally end. It is hardly necessary to stress the dignity of the psyche as an object of natural science. With all the more urgency, then, we must emphasize that the smallest alteration in the psychic factor, if it be an alteration of principle, is of the utmost significance as regards our knowledge of the world and the picture we make of it. The integration of unconscious contents into consciousness, which is the main endeavor of analytical psychology, is just such an alteration of principle, in that it does away with the sovereignty of the subjective ego consciousness and confronts it with unconscious collective contents. Yeah.
Well done, you.
God bless you.
Yeah.
But God doesn't exist. He exists everywhere.
I'd echo what Robin was saying about the, you know, potential uses of psychedelics for, you know, all kind of perceived good purposes, like, you know, maybe kind of making us less authoritarian and more liberal and more open-minded and more connected as well. You know, I liked your recent paper on increased connectedness. I also did a survey on eco-consciousness and psychedelics, and that people did report feeling much more connected with nature and consequently often more concerned with nature, and not just their attitudes, but also people changed their behaviors. They took up gardening, and they started changing their diets, and and adopting animals and even changing their careers to be more kind of ecologically oriented. So we do have these kind of behavioral changes which go with the attitude changes, which seem to stem from the use of psychedelics, so they have a lot of potential uses. It's like there's actually kind of no limit to the kind of potential uses of psychedelics. Perhaps it's as limited only by our imagination, and the one thing that psychedelics are good for, it seems, is enhancing the imagination. So they're kind of bootstrapping themselves into possible uses in the future, if I can say that and make any sense. I don't really know. So, the possibility is that they could be used for healing or creativity or creative problem solving, for insight, not just personal insight, but also kind of scientific understanding and insights about the nature of consciousness and how the brain functions. They can be used perhaps for personal spiritual growth, but there's no possible limitations. They're kind of non-specific amplifiers of the psyche in a way, and so you could use them for whatever uses that they may take. And we don't know what the future's going to hold, and it could be that they can help us find the flexibility to kind of bend with whatever comes down the other end of the clock. So they can also help us, as Robin said, and Jung also said, well, he didn't say about psychedelics. He wasn't a big fan of psychedelics, incidentally, Jung. He said he'd have to take the visions on trust, I believe.
Yeah, he said you get enough from dreams and fantasy or something.
Which you get a lot, definitely.
You don't
get a lot. No, I mean, having studied dreams, you do get a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anywhere you cannot go by studying your dreams that you can get to with psychedelics, actually. But psychedelics kind of they're a bit more immediate. But they can help us understand who we are, as individuals, as cultures, as a species, and also as beings. What does it mean to be? How do we understand what it is to be? And I think that's hugely important. I think we can, benefit a lot from all of that.
I would want to kind of put a slight sort of caveat on psychedelics being used for anything, because my own view is
Don't operate heavy machinery.
Yeah, there you go. And sometimes, although, sitting with people in high doses, as I've said before we've said as a team, this bizarre thing that happens that you really don't feel like you're in the company of someone who is, inebriated or intoxicated or unhinged or whatever, or even lacks control, really. It feels often like you're in the company of someone in possession of a profound wisdom. However, things, they can sometimes become sort of seduced by an image, say, maybe a nightmarish image, and then be, severely affected by it and need some reassurance and some guidance when that happens. So, I think there's a lot to be said for, of course, context with psychedelics, and that although they can be sort of truth revealers, and I know that issue will come up, but what's truth, what's reality, but truth in the sense of things that have a deep resonance. But they, as I, do see, people can sort of be taken off the scent with psychedelics, and end up telling you about things that really don't resonate. At least they don't resonate with me. And if they do, they resonate because they're tapping into, in my view, you'll say it's circular, the collective unconscious. But I suppose my challenge for that view would be give me something that is as plausible and as earthy, as an inherited mind. And I'm waiting for it.
I'll go with that.
So that's the end of the A section. Before we have a Q&A, please put our hands together for
Give us a hold. I think your turn.